Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Pearson Center. I think we've got representatives here that are going from coast to coast, which is great because it represents what the Pearson Center is, which is a pan-national think tank from a centrist position looking at a good policy and reaching out to people in both the business and labor community to make sure we get that voice and take that voice to government and to authorities right across Canada. Today, we're having a very special conversation. I'm very delighted to as chair of the Pearson Center, to welcome the panelists who are going to join us. And then I'm going to sit back and watch over the next 45 or so minutes. We've got a great conversation in this time of the pandemic. And we're really pleased. We're calling it our launch of the Back to Work series here online. The world's changed a lot since February. I think Canada is coping remarkably well, and it is in large part to some of the leadership, some of whom we're seeing today, and how they're stepping up and helping government and authority make decisions to bring us out of this pandemic. I'm delighted to introduce, first you'll see on the screen Goldie Hyder, who leads Canada's preeminent Business Council of Canada, which represents hundreds of organizations across the country and millions of employees. And not being able to see him, but we can hear him, we've got Hassan Youssef, who is president of the Canadian Labour Congress. Now, these two have appeared with the Pearson Center in the past, and we're delighted to have them join us again. Hassan, his union, many unions right across the country are members of the Canadian Congress. So his voice for working people in Canada really is the preeminent voice. And we have Jonathan Callip, who is a longtime advisor to the panel, who comes to us from the University of Ottawa. And I want to get the words right here because you're also involved with the Telfer School of Management at the university and a leading authority on foresight. That's quite a leading authority category. In any event, Jonathan, thanks for all the work you've done for the Pearson Center over the years, and I'm happy to turn it over to you as we get started on a critical conversation today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sandra, and it's always great working with you. I think we've shared the podium many times. Look, it's hard to believe, Goldie, Hassan, it was just 2 months ago that we were chatting about the future of work, and my God, you two seem prophetic, because when I asked you, what are the skills needed for the future? Both of you said workers and managers need to be adaptable, flexible, and resilient. Who would have known just 2 months later that would be called into play in the ways we haven't seen before? Kudos as well to both your organizations who have been front and center in the fight against COVID-19 in terms of businesses adapting production lines. And Goldie, you've had a few series of interviews about what we'll take to get out of this. Hassan, what you have done in terms of making available to your members the information needed for both economic security and job as well in terms of life and limb. Both of you have been front and center, I know, behind the scenes with the government, making sure that Canadians, businesses, employees are taken care of, as we move forward. And in that light, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. First one really deals with today and now. And one of the things that Pearson will look at afterwards is our Prime Minister has made it very clear that we're in an era of, I'm going to call it agile policy, where he says, I put out the mechanisms to deal with this. And then as we find out that groups and individuals have been left out, issues are still to be confronted, we fix it and move forward. That's far better right now than debating, analyzing, studying, and then 2 years from now, putting the policy in play. So as I look at today, so the next 2 to 3 months, and Hassan, I'm going to start with you. What is missing in that policy agenda? What is missing in the support mechanisms that you think should be added into the next tranche? And Goldie, I'll ask you that right after. So Hassan, first to you in terms of what's needed.
Well, thanks for having me. And again, thanks for, of course, inviting both of us to come back and be panelists. I think the government has moved very quickly to design and implement, of course, income support for workers, but also trying to ensure that businesses also having support from the government. And of course, within that move to do this in such a quick period, there are going to be, of course, a need for changes to happen, to adapt their policy to make sure that the gaps that have been identified by different organizations and groups, those gaps, of course, are going to be be closed. We've seen the government move to fill those gaps. Of course, they first announced, of course, the wage subsidy program. The threshold was set very low. The government quickly adjusted and increased that to 75%. Similarly, on the income support for workers, it was clearly recognized there were some workers, of course, already working in the economy, but not making, of course, a lot of money. The government quickly adjusted the program to ensure those workers can stay and work, earn some income, but at the same time be available to, of course, receive government help at the same time. The government has also moved forward to ensure that students who are not part of the initial program, how they can ensure that the policy can be adapted to, of course, to support students. So I think in the context of the speed in which government having to move, the policy are going to make, they are going to make some decisions that are going to have some gaps, but once those gaps have been identified, I think the government's quite been resilient to listen to the criticism, but also to make sure they can adapt their policy to ensure they're taking care of as many Canadians as possible.
And Hassan, what is needed right now in terms of filling some of those gaps?
Well, there are going to be some sectors going to require some very, I think, some additional support. The airline sectors, of course, are pretty well 90% of it right now are not flying across the country. We're going to have to bring in some measures to support the airline sector. They're a critical and essential part of our economy. I think the government has continued to, of course, to listen to the voices that's been made in regard to the support they're going to have to continue to do. The Federation of Municipalities just last week, of course, have reached out to the federal government to say we need some support from you. I think the government is going to have to look at how they adapt their policy to support our municipalities going through some very, very difficult challenges right now, given that the majority of business are shut down within their jurisdiction.
So you see those as your big area. Goldie, what about you in terms of with your members? And again, we're talking about the right now. Later, I'll talk about 6 months to a year, and then we're going to go beyond that. But I want to focus on immediacy.
Sure. Well, Jonathan, as you said, I mean, the more how quickly things change. It's great to be back here with you and your colleagues and my friend Hassan, of course. Look, we're in an unprecedented situation. I know that's overstated a lot. We should start by acknowledging, that nobody signed up for this, whether in public service, whether you're in politics. Certainly, the healthcare workers are doing yeoman service throughout the country. We owe them a lot of gratitude. They're working very hard in the public service and in the governments right across this country. And there's a lot that has been gotten right. And I think, unfortunately, too often, whether I'm saying it or other people are saying it, the safe landings don't get reported in the news. It's when you pick out the things that didn't get right. But as Hassan said, I think overall we've done a really effective job as a country. And I can't underscore how important it is for the business community for us to see the government being guided by health advice. We were probably one of the, if not the first organization to come out. We created a national letter with 100 CEOs, ran in 3 different newspapers back in March 15th or so that said, shut us down. It's very rare for business to say to government, A, get involved in my life, but B, to shut down my business. But we were saying it on the basis of, if you really want to get ahead of the health crisis, then let's do the right thing and take some short-term pain for some long-term gain. The government made a lot of policy decisions that got done quite quickly. The decision to close the border, something we were again very actively behind the scenes on, move the tax filing dates, the temporary foreign workers for our farm sectors and so forth. A lot of things that the government has been able to do and do quite well. I think that there's a tendency to say that in a crisis we should just we all want to be as supportive as we can be, but I would say that in a crisis when lives are at stake, we need to learn on the fly. We can't wait for historians and academics to talk about what took place and what was done right or wrong. And so those of us who are trying to be constructive in our feedback are saying, let's learn. It's been 6 weeks. There's a pattern here. One of the things that I think we need to change, and I'm starting to see it changing, is government doesn't know best. You're not going to be rewarded for getting it right or wrong, or punished for getting it wrong. You'll probably be more likely to get it punished for being wrong, but be more inclusive. Bring in business, bring in labor, bring in others who are being affected, so that when you announce programs, including bringing in the provinces at times, I'm told, when you're announcing programs, there's a sense of we did do some outreach. We did hear whether 10% would have been sufficient for a program, or is it going to end up being 75%? Because that's a big leap in a short period of time. And I think the more we consult, the more we engage, the more likely that we're going to get those programs and those policies right. Why it's important is most of what's been announced, and this kind of leads me to your second question in a way, is it expires. These programs expire. The money that we've allocated so far, June 15th-ish, is gone. And so while the programs are still being implemented and executed and money is being rolled out to workers and businesses, there remains a lot to do. There's a lot of voids, and I know that there's only so much you can do at once, but yes, the airline industry is waiting. Yes, the energy sector is waiting. Yes, the tourism sector is waiting. Yes, we're waiting to see the details on the retail side, because as important as it is to give the money to people, they're going to need places to go back to work to. And so we're going to have to make sure that the businesses also survive, so that these employees can go back to places to work. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I thought from a top line perspective overall, really good job given the circumstances. Let's learn what we can do better as we go forward, because this is not something that's going to end anytime soon. We're going to be dealing with this for quite some time.
Now, I'll ask you a question on that in a second, but for those of you, and I'm very impressed with how many people are viewing this. While you can't ask questions, your microphones are not active, you can use the chat function, and we have somebody monitoring that, and there'll be Q&A at the end of this. Goldie, you just made an interesting statement. It's not ending anytime soon. CNN last night said that reviving America will take years, not months. And so I think there's a realism now about restrictions might be brought down, but it's going to take a while. What are you hearing in terms of how long it will take to get up? And in your mind, and you've been writing about this, what is the plan for the next 6 months, year, 2 years for bringing the economy back on? And then Hassan, I'll have you respond.
I use the tiptoe analogy. I think we have to tiptoe our way back in a responsible way, guided by our public health advice. We have a lot to do on that side. We need way more testing in Canada. We need way more access to the protective equipment, not just for our healthcare workers. They've been begging for it for a long time now, and we've been supplying, industry and business and government has found a way to supply that. But we need to make sure that workplaces are safe to return to. We need to make sure that when businesses open up, the customer wants to come. I mean, the worst thing to do is throw a party and nobody shows up. And by the way, that's happening in other countries that are going before us. So one of the things also I would say from a public policy perspective is we really need to pay attention to best practices. Who's doing it well? Who's not doing it so well? Look, I don't think there's a light switch, as the Prime Minister said, and others have said, we're not going to just turn Canada back on. Provinces are going to come at it differently. Just now, Premier Ford has announced Ontario's plan, which is several months still out, it sounds like. Scott Moe and Saskatchewan's getting ready to go as early as May the 4th with sort of a phase 1, PEI, New Brunswick. So we're going to be tiptoeing our way back into it. But we have to recognize that a U recovery to our economy or a V recovery to our economy, we can probably manage. What we cannot manage is a W recovery to our economy, a recovery that requires a second shutdown. I think that would have catastrophic effects psychologically on Canadians, and for sure financially on governments, and therefore generations to come who have to pay for it. So we have to do everything that we can to avoid it. That's the immediate short-term agenda. Look, I think we have to err on the side of caution. I think business is saying let's err on the side of caution, but we have to have more testing capabilities. We have to be able to test. We have to be able to make sure that we're able to track and trace and be transparent with the data about this virus. And we as Canadians are going to have to accept that there are going to be flare-ups as we start this process. Saskatchewan just had one. Alberta just had one. But if we can track it, trace it, contain it, that doesn't mean the economy has to shut down right away. In terms of the long run, look, we are 2 to 3 years out. I mean, I do a podcast called Speaking of Business, and I invite your listeners to tune in. There's all these special series around the COVID, and they're all CEOs, and they're doing about 15, 20 minutes about what are they doing to deal with the crisis, what are they doing for the community, and so forth. And what we're realizing is how much impact this is going to happen on businesses. Consolidation is going to be taking place. supply chains are going to be changing. We're going to be rethinking Asia versus the continent. So there's a lot that could happen, but I think it's years away, not imminent.
Hassan, same question to you, and you represent literally the front line. I mean, it's the worker that has the concern about getting back, and I'm sure there's a lot that you have been talking about on that regard. So the same question to you, what is the getting back plan from your perspective? What are you talking about these days?
Well, first and foremost, I think we must, of course, move slowly and thoughtfully. I mean, that's the reality in terms of what we know so far, and of course, what we should be considering of in regard to how we get back here at the end of the day. Some, of course, provinces are looking like they are going to start to open up the economy slowly. The bigger question is nobody should go to work unless we have personal protective equipment for them in the first place. Because in absence of that, we're just sending workers out to get sick, and that's unacceptable in our view. The bigger question is going to be, of course, how much capacity do we have to test, of course, and trace in regard, should people get infected? How do we get to test them, but more importantly, how do we get to trace that going forward? There's much to be learned here, I think, in the short term, that the provinces are going to have to be very slow, but equally agile in regard to the efforts that they're going to put in. I think there should be some coordination. I think there is at least a desire, both from the premiers and the prime minister, to have some common set of principles which they can agree on. I think that would be very critical for the country. I don't think we want to treat a province or region differently than we should be approaching the entire country as to how we do this, I think, in a responsible way. But the reality, of course, we don't know how long this is going to take. Nobody can predict with any certainty what the time frame is. And I don't think we should try to set the time frame thinking we've got to have this figured out by whatever time there is. I mean, much of the science of this pandemic and the virus are still being analyzed and being talked about by the scientists. And as much as we think we know lots, I think there's a lot we don't know yet. And the reality is, of course, everybody is anxious that let's get back to normal. I'm not sure we want to go back to normal, because I don't like the normal that I've been able to watch and see in the last little while since the country has been shut down. If that's what normal is, I think we need to get rid of normal and build something completely different in that regard. We're told some 400,000 workers on the front line are essential. Yet what we know about these workers' conditions in work and wages and working conditions they've been working under is unacceptable. And I think as a country that want to say these are our heroes, we don't treat heroes in this way. I don't think any country can accept this in regard to the future. So I think for many of us, of course, what this crisis has shown fundamentally, that we have to rethink what the normal is. The second point I would like to make, I think, and I think everybody's reflecting on this, we have allowed ourselves to be complacent in regard to the essential things we need to do to manage our country in a safe way. And what we recognize through this pandemic, too much of our supplies was, of course, a shift offshore, and we have no capacity to do that in a very safe way. I think as Canadians will expect that our country needs to do better. We have the capacity to build these personal protective equipment in our country, and we've got to build the manufacturing base to make sure that happens. It'll create jobs here. At the same time, of course, it'll give it the kind of security we need as a country to go forward in that regard. I also think we need to address the frontline concerns that we're seeing day in and day out. The people that we were told who were the pioneers who helped build this great country of ours, who are dying in our long-term care facilities at a rate none of us would accept, I think we've got to say, how do we fix this system once and for all to ensure they can live in their golden ages in place in retirement home whenever ever having to put up with what we're seeing right now and witnessing. And on the workers who are doing that job, if we truly value them as heroes, I think we're going to have to find a better way as to how we treat them, how we pay them, but equally, how do we train them to perform that job and see this as an essential. And I think in that regard, we need better standards in this country that is uniform, that Canadians can come to accept. And if they have to find a way to pay for that, we're going to also have to do that. I think the bigger challenge is going to come as to how do we ramp up the economy when the time is right to create the kinds of work that people are going to need. We don't know how much business failures are going to be in the country. And I think, of course, what we're seeing right now, we've got a public service that's performed brilliantly, better than we can expect. But reality is, I think public sector is going to have to play an important role, and the government is going to have to play an important role of how we fund the recovery of our country and the infrastructure is going to require for us to take a look at, and how do we invest in that for the future.
So that's interesting what you bring up, and that goes back to you. Hassan has recognized certain industries that this has shown that we have some cracks in the regulatory and training area. And then he's also identified supply chain as being a critical issue for the future. And I've been hearing the same thing. Is global supply chain over? Do we want to go more regional? I've also been hearing talk about doing now push more into robotics. So since Hassan has taken us 2 to 5 years ahead, Goldie, your response, what are you hearing from your leaders in terms of, do we go back to the way things were before, or is this an opportunity, in a sense, a terrible one, to move forward on new strategies?
Well, I've been saying publicly that if you want to honor the lives that have been lost, make life better for those that have lived. So I agree with Hassan. We don't want to go back to things that we thought that areas where we need to be better in. I'm hoping that coming out of this is that Canada itself looks in the mirror and says, what do we need to do to be better first, right? Like I think even on this issue of safety, we need to make Canada safe for Canadians first. We've got to create confidence that our country, even if it acts as 13 jurisdictions from time to time, there is a certainty that when I travel, if I tour, if I go out to a restaurant, if I go to a sporting event, that wherever I am, I'm safe. I am safe as Canadian. I think we need to put a lot of emphasis on how to do that. The other thing, of course, is, and I don't know, I think I mentioned this to you, but my master's thesis 30 some odd years ago was about policy making in times of crisis. There's a couple of things that I recall that came out of that are probably just as relevant today. One of them is it's actually a really bad idea to make policies during the crisis, because you don't realize that subconsciously your emotion is affected by the moment that you find yourself in. And so historically, when you do a policy making in times of crisis, you end up making it for the exception rather than the rule. And so I would urge caution in wanting to just go over an entire public policy overhaul right now, because this is going to pass. There's going to be a normal. It's going to be a new normal, but it's going to pass. Second thing that came out of it was dangerous to make predictions in a crisis about all that's going to change. I just noted the other day that there are, you'd be surprised to learn this, but there are more bookings for cruises for next March than there were a year ago in March for this March. So you would think, who's going to cruise? Turns out some people are like, you know what, I'm retired, I want to take a cruise, I'm going to take a cruise. So behavior may change, but maybe not as much as we might think so. I think the one area, and Hassan touched on it, the one area in particular where change needs to happen is in healthcare. It is a public policy issue that we have avoided politically going back 2 decades, I think. I haven't heard any responsible conversations or discussions about healthcare. I think Canadians were long ago ready for it. They're even more ready for it now for the reasons that Hassan cited. I mean, I will tell you that business attitude on this issue about how to manage this virus changed about 5 weeks ago when many of my members had their board meetings for volunteer activities of hospital boards, hospital foundations, and other philanthropic activities. It was a weekend. And out of the blue, I started getting calls from people saying, Goldie, there is a healthcare crisis that is going to bring the system to a collapse if we don't get ahead of this virus. And it was that consideration that motivated us to say, shut the economy down because we can't manage it. So I think we have to be ready to have a responsible discussion about healthcare after this.
So this is getting back to the fundamentals from both of you. Hassan, do you see it that way as well? Let's not worry about where's industry technology going. We got to kind of focus on building the kind of Canada we want. And this is providing that sort of an opportunity. And if so, what are you seeing, Hassan?
Well, I think what this crisis has pointed out to us, despite how we have always looked at ourselves with a little bit of smugness about our healthcare system, which, there is some truth to that, but I think we glorified how well our system was doing. And I think what this crisis has pointed out, there's repair and there's need to strengthen the healthcare system in this country from one end to the other, because in absence of it, think how worse this would have been for Canadians to begin with. The reality, of course, we're going to need to, of course, in the next little while, of course, truly tackle the big questions. Okay, if we should ever have another pandemic, can we simply, as a nation, rely on other countries to supply us with equipment that we need to main share or guarding against Canadians becoming ill in the first place. I don't think anybody would accept that. So as much as that has been said about globalization, I think the reality is I think we're going to have to come together and find a consensus to how we tackle those issues. On the bigger thing, I think the bigger challenges ahead at the end of the day is that in the next little while, of course, as you know, I don't think Canadians who serve in other programs that the government has brought in really know where their next paycheck is going to come from. What happens on that magic date? And how do we address the concerns? Of course, had it not been for the federal government, which is spending most of the money so far to sustain Canadians, of course, and staying home, we're going to have to figure out where does the big investment come in the short while and to some degree in the long term, as to how do we build and repair and rebuild this economy going forward. And in that regard, of course, there's much to be done. We need a real sustained public infrastructure investment to go forward. We need, of course, to deal with some of the other challenges that we've been debating in the last election around climate, and how do we get to some transition, and more importantly, how can we expand the public service to ensure what we've been able to experience during this crisis, they're there to perform that service should we need them in the future, because every province, of course, had to rely on a public service to meet their needs in this moment. And at a time when we didn't value it, we're recognizing the value of the public service throughout this country.
What we're going to have to remember, though, Jonathan, if I can just say, is the fiscal reality of where we're going to find ourselves can't just be overlooked either, right? If we have just blown to smithereens, for all the reasons that are obvious, our so-called debt to GDP ratio that we would use as our flagpole to say how great things are. And that is an important balance that I think Canadians are going to have to reconcile. It's the same balance that Canadians are going to have to reconcile as are others on the idea that, you know, we should be making everything in Canada. Look, we're too small. We're too small. We're going to be a trading nation. We're going to be an immigration nation. We're going to be a nation that requires investment. And so consumer attitudes and public attitudes have to change. Like, we all want the best product at the cheapest price. Turns out other countries can do that better than we can, you know, and many other countries in this part of the hemisphere can. I do think we need to look at the priorities that Hassan has alluded to. We all agree there should never be a day ever where we're going to be finding ourselves short of ventilators or masks or basic, you know, needs for our healthcare workers, because that is what drove this crisis. In many ways, our inability to mitigate it at the healthcare level has created some of the problems that we have here. So again, as I said earlier, there's a lot of things you say in a crisis. We may not feel the same way about it when we're the customer 2 years from now saying, oh no, I still want the cheaper product at the best price, right? So just understand that things may change, but they may not change. But the fiscal situation is a reality that we can't change now. We're $200 billion plus into deficit alone. The debt is probably over $800 billion today, where, as I said, programs expire in June. We're probably into this for another year, if not longer, depends on the vaccine. How much more deficit and debt can we be going into, even despite the low interest rate environment, where we have a duty to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren now to do what we can to help pay that off at the same time. So the investments need to be smart. They can't just be, you know, money for everybody.
But what I find fascinating in terms of talking to the two of you, and this goes back to our chat a few months ago, and I hope the listeners recognize this, that this is so Canadian, that we have the head of large business, the head of the labor movement, the unions, both agreeing ostensibly on what the focus needs to be going out, and that is on the healthcare, that is on the health system, and that is on supply to ensure health. So there's an agreement on the priority value that I suspect is bringing the two of you together in a way that when this crisis is over, I suspect there'll be some interesting planning going on. I'm seeing healthcare investments, I'm seeing research investments. So basically what both of you are saying is there are those areas where we really need to be self-sufficient, where we really need to have supply, and that's in this health area. There's other areas where, Goldie, you're saying not so quick. There's some consequences associated with it, and Hassan can agree as well, although it might be nice to have a little bit more value chain given what we've been suffering in these times. And Goldie, I'm sure your businesses are saying the same thing. Might be good to have a backup plan when the next, and it doesn't have to be a COVID. It can be any other sort of crisis that shuts down elements of the value chain. But again, I'm so privileged to have both of you once again sharing your thoughts and sharing your insights. And I look forward to hearing more about this when you go through, and we'll get back at the end of this to our discussions on the jobs of the future. But for now, I think the focus is on what are we doing today and what are we doing when we come out of it. And I'm very grateful for what you've provided. Now, it's a little bit past 2:30. I apologize. Andrew, we have a few questions. I want to make sure there's opportunity for those questions to be brought in.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sure can.
Okay, we've got a number of great questions and I'll try and go through them fairly quick. So the first one, any thoughts on what the new economy will look like? Will service workers be recognized as an essential service and be paid accordingly? Will people continue to shop online and retail not survive? What is our new normal environmentally, socially, and economically? Okay, a lot of great questions in there, but Goldie, why don't you go first?
Look, my sense is that what history teaches us is there's a pendulum to these things, right? It'll swing hard one way, it'll swing hard another way, but over time, it'll settle. It'll settle finding the right balance between what was, what is, and what can be. I hope that the consequence of this experience that we're going through is learning more about ourselves as a country. I think Hassan referenced it himself, but we can be better. We can be stronger. We can move quicker. We can act with more urgency. We can be more collaborative and more coordinated in the way in which we function. We can compete better. And that means having the best public policies that allow that. And that includes ensuring that people who are on our front lines and our essential workers and our laborers and others are receiving the best pay, the best standards, the best healthcare. That is an ambition that we should all share. And I hope we come out of this a country less, again, Hassan referenced this earlier, or Jonathan, I think you did, but like we take, satisfaction in being better than somebody else with our healthcare system or better than somebody else. Who cares? We should be the best that we can be, and I think we need to be more ambitious, and leadership that provides us a guiding light, a North Star about what the promise of Canada is and can be, I think will be rewarded politically and by the public. And so I hope we can have that conversation as we go forward. In terms of the changes, sure, there's going to be some changes. Telework, I got many members who say I got more space than I need, I realize, because a bunch of my workers can actually work from home. It's good for the economy, it's good for their family, it's good for me. It's a win-win-win all around. But we're human beings. We're still going to want a lot of interaction. We're going to want to go out. We're going to want to meet. So are we going to see conferences tomorrow? No. But telehealth, telelearning, telework, I think those are three areas for sure. Probably, teleconferences, tele-events and stuff like that for the next couple of years, where I don't see us flying around the world just to get together because it's nice to get together. So those are some opportunities for us. But in the long run, I think things settle. I think we go back to being a natural resource economy and a human resource economy where I think we have great opportunities.
Hassan?
I do believe that Canadians from all walks of life have recognized that the people that we're celebrating for their heroic commitment to go to work and to keep ensuring that we can have groceries and people actually working in the grocery stores. We've got workers who are working, of course, in the food supply system and are getting sick, by the way, and of course, realizing that none of these workers were ever treated properly. They work in precarious condition. The wages were mostly low. They didn't know what normal hours were to begin with. So I think we've got to do a better job as to how we're going to take care of these workers, because the next time we should have a pandemic, they may not show up and tell us to go to hell, and rightfully so, because I think we didn't do what was necessary. I think we can't treat people this way. If they are essential and important, and they truly are heroes, I think we need to reflect on that. And this would not take that much to fix. The reality is these workers are invaluable, but for far too long, they were invisible to our society, and I'm glad that we're having the opportunity. The other side, I think we should also take consideration in many occasions. A good number of these workers are also racialized workers. They're not just workers in general. They're workers who has a distinct reality and an ethnic background, and I think a large part of that justifies the treatment that they receive, and I think we can do better. Of course, I'm one of those people who don't believe you can always turn back the clock in regard to what we have learned during this crisis. We all have learned to use technology in ways we didn't think was humanly possible. we're doing all kinds of things that I think have shown that we have the ability to adapt. But I know human beings as such, we do like to congregate. We do like to see friends and places and do things in a way that is also what's a norm about the society. And I think despite the fact that people are doing a lot of online shopping and what have you, I'm not sure that those things are going to disappear. I think they're going to remain part of our life, but I think we sometimes do more than one thing. So I think there's certain part of this particular crisis that have brought us in ways in which we're sharing technology to access things that we weren't able to do it in the past. I think Canadians will continue to do that, but at the same time, I think, at least in my neighborhood, I still prefer to go and see the corner store that operates the local bakery that I visit. I don't want to buy my cookies online, by the way, and have somebody put it in a van and ship it to me. I prefer to go and see the bakery. And I think those are things that we are all going to return to when we know it's safe, and we can do that without, of course, furthering the crisis. So I think there's some things will change, and I think we will adapt. I've learned to, of course, adapt with not being in my office. And I never thought I could do that as well as I'm doing it. But the reality is, I think we're all changing in that regard. But it's hard to really predict what the future would look like at this point of the game. I think a lot will change, but I think also too, we like some things that we consider to be normal. And as soon as we can get back to them, I know many of us will get back to it. The last point I would make is about traveling. And I do a lot of traveling. And actually, I don't really miss it, to be honest with you. I haven't got on a plane now for over close to 2 months. And I'm not yearning to get on a plane either. And that's an unusual thing for me, when I would be on a flight 3 or 4 times a week, crisscrossing the country, talking to my members, visiting regions. I noticed some invaluableness in having that connection. But I think it equally shows that we can do that much more for the planet by not doing that traveling at the end of the day. So lots will change, but I'm only one individual. We'll see what really comes when we're able to get back to what we consider to be normal.
Okay, thank you. Next, we've seen many women emerge as key leaders in this process. Do you believe that corporate leadership in Canada will change because of these great new female role models? Hassan, you first.
Well, I think that what we've been able to witness is quite remarkable. Most, of course, at the provincial level are the people we rely upon for advice every single day about how to cope with this virus. All the scientists that have been advising us have been women. I think it's remarkable to see the diversity of faces that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. The challenge, of course, as you know, women still live in an unequal world that we're living in today. I think we've got lots more to do to make it possible for them to, of course, to have that sense of equality that we all would like to strive for. But at the same time, too, I'm reflecting on, the CBC did an interesting piece yesterday about domestic violence. And despite all the things that we're seeing about great women leaders that we're witnessing, of course, during this crisis, there's so many women whose lives remain very vulnerable because they're trapped in their home, unable to get out of that situation, of course, and they're experiencing domestic violence because they're with a partner, of course, who now can't escape each other, and they're more subjected. I think it also speaks to how much more we have to do to make this country a better place for women to live their lives in a full way without ever having to experience what the CBC has exposed the other day in their piece.
Goldie?
Yeah, I'd say the same. The end part there, it's unfortunate that a lot of the jobs that have been impacted in terms of job losses, women have faced the brunt of it. And I know that some people in this area are getting ready to put a piece out. I encourage you to look for it this week, probably in the Globe and Mail, about how this has been disproportionate. But on the positive side, as a father of 3 daughters, I mean, I've long been an advocate and a champion for more women leadership, period. It's a journey. We have to have the pipelines. I hope we all learn from this that the pipelines need to be there. But you look at those rock star women public health officials from Bonnie out in BC all the way across the country here. And then you read about the political leadership of countries led by women from New Zealand to Germany and Finland and many of the countries in Scandinavia and others. And I think there's something to be learned from this. I've long said that I think that women bring more EQ to leadership than men do. And I think that combination that women have of EQ and IQ really helps them be better leaders in many cases. And I think in a crisis, is born to be true because instinctively women are collaborators. They will listen, they will bring people in, they will hear different points of view, and they will tell you how the process is going to work. But when they're ready to make a decision and they make one, it's decided. Believe me, I know that living with 4 of them here, but when they told me what it's going to be that. And there's something to be said, because at a time like this, you want decisive leadership.
Okay, next question. Will the pandemic drive a faster adoption of productivity enhancing technologies? And if so, how will this impact the labor force?
Can I just say, how many of you have been complaining about, technology before, about many of our members and their ability to provide, reliable broadband and Wi-Fi and so forth? I've talked to many of our members in that space. I've done a podcast with Joe Natale over at Rogers and stuff. Canadians are phoning in to say thank you now. They're saying, hey, listen, I mean, picking on my bank or picking on my telco was my Canadian thing to do. I think we gotta smarten up and realize that it's a huge competitive advantage. Digital infrastructure and making sure that there isn't discrimination, that we're able to get it out to what is a vast second largest landmass in the world as a country. We have to be able to make sure that equal opportunity exists in rural Canada, in northern Canada, our territories. This is a reminder to us that the digital connectivity around 5G and having to deal with some of those tougher public policy issues they're not down the road. They're here now. We need to do it now. We need to get ready for those things now. And I'm hoping that on issues like that, we're going to mature in our public policy discussion and be able to invest and grow our economy, because I do think there's going to be more, and I mentioned at least 3 areas, but if my kids have been learning from home, there'll probably be more of that for the next little while here, teleconferencing and other things that I said. It's going to require more support and more infrastructure from a 5G perspective and from a broader perspective. And so when we look at our infrastructure programs, historically, we've been looking at them as stimulus to create jobs. In the last 2 months, we've been using stimulus as a job preservation program. It hasn't been a job creation program, it's been how to preserve it. When we look ahead, we need to look at infrastructure, not just from the environment side, which is obviously important, but also from a technological perspective. And I think Canadians need to think like that.
Okay, over to you, Hassan.
Well, I think what this crisis certainly has pointed out, the unequalness of Canada again in access to the internet and that kind of service. Right here in the city of Toronto, when the schools got shut down, finally they got the teachers engaged about how they can help the kids online. And we realized there's in the city of Toronto, one of the largest cities in the country, some 300,000 plus kids didn't have access to the internet. They didn't have the device that could even allow them to do so. So of course the Toronto School Board had to make those devices available, and I'm so grateful that these kids finally have access to the internet. I hope after the crisis that those devices will remain with those families so they can continue, of course, to use them in a way that will be able to enhance their life. But I think it speaks to the bigger question. As a country, some of us are fortunate to take these services for granted. I think the internet now should be seen as an essential service. How can we guarantee and expand that every part of this country, including rural parts of Canada, that actually we have the infrastructure there now available for Canadians to utilize? Because in moments like this, we realize quite often how important it is for us to have contact with the outside world, but equally how we can use it as a tool, what is to learn, but also to do to do our jobs on a day-to-day basis. So we've got lots to learn, but hopefully there's an appreciation about the need to strengthen, of course, this infrastructure and to grow it and to build it to make sure it's not something that we keep talking about, it's something we can actually do.
Okay, we're kind of out of time. There's a whole lot of great questions that have come in. I'm going to ask you one quick question. It's actually complex, but I'm sure you can do this quickly. Do you think we're tiptoeing around this too much? Should we approach the lockdown, the shutdown in a more determined way, such as Sweden and Taiwan? Just quickly.
Too late. It should have been done at the very day one if that's the case. We are where we are now, so we can't go back. So I think any measures like emergencies and stuff they were for another day. Where they could come back, however, is if there was to be a second shutdown and Canadians weren't happy about that, then it's possible we would need more aggressive action on the parts of governments, but I don't see any place for it today.
Okay, Hassan?
Well, we certainly have learned lots, and I think I always says, in hindsight, we can always do better. And I'm hoping that our elected leaders would learn from this. But more importantly, how do we collaborate and work better with each other? Because that's always the strength of this country. If we could do that better, I think we can do a far better job in serving the interests of Canadians overall.
Okay, well, that ends our time. We've gone a little bit over time. I just want to say a sincere thank you to Hassan Youssef and Goldie Hyder for an incredibly important discussion. Both of you play a key role in our economy. Thank you for taking the time for joining us. We've had well over 100 people join us, and on behalf of all of them, thank you. There are several questions that didn't get asked. We will keep them all in file, and actually they will help us develop our next few seminars or webinars. I want to just tell everybody who's online that we'll be having webinars every week to 10 days. So please keep in touch with us and we'll be sending you information on that. In the meantime, we've set up a quick email address. If you want to get back to us on any of these issues, just email us at rsvp.pearson@gmail.com. And thank you all very much and see you soon. Bye for now.
Before we go off, we have technology behind the scenes, as both Goldie and Hassan pointed out. Andrew, can you give a big thanks to our tech specialists who kept this up and running?
Yes, thank you to Jay Strauss and Kathy Lanway for your help.